Hello, welcome to Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. My name is Cameron Miller. I don't want to preach so much today as just share some thoughts. Jesus gave us a true gem this morning. More accurately, I should say, Matthew gave us the gem in his memory of Jesus. So by way of my granddad, I want to talk about this story from Jesus, which is from Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28, which is appointed for 11 Pentecost. Well, by all accounts, my granddad was a peach. I never knew him. He died before I was born. As a dentist in his small town, an average American town for those days, he cared for people, all kinds of people, some of whom pushed his comfort zone. I know that because of stories that were passed down in my family. But I also know, because my dad told me in a quiet moment, that my granddad belonged to the Ku Klux Klan, the Indiana Klan as it was known in those parts. Now, the way my dad explained this to me, when I was quite a bit younger, was that back in the day, my grandfather's day, the Klan was like a political party, and it had a social dimension because almost everybody belonged to it. Actually, my dad was not quite so effusive as I am. He'd have said because almost everybody belonged to it. I checked that out, and indeed, in Indiana, Indiana has the dubious distinction of being the state with the highest ever Klan registration. From 1920 to 1925, 30% of, quote, native-born white men in Indiana, as the record says, belonged to the Indiana chapter of the Klan, and the governor and over half of the legislature. Everyone was in it. I think that was the phrase that my dad used to explain it. Now, my dad also had a childhood memory that he told me about being with his father in a downtown building. I think at night, he said, when a Klan meeting let out and being scared by the procession of men in robes coming down the dark stairway. Well, the mind has lots of tricks. We know that. Because my granddad was a good guy, I embraced my dad's explanation for quite some time. Then one day, the dissonance embedded in that explanation agitated me enough so that I started to think more and more about it. Now, the heart of the Ku Klux Klan is racism and bigotry against African Americans and Jewish Americans and Roman Catholics and nearly any immigrant of any kind other than from Northern Europe. It does not matter if everyone was doing it. There's no way around the darkness at the heart of that beast. You do not become part of evil without first having that evil within or getting poisoned by more of it while being part of it. My grandfather may have been a wonderful guy to his family and some members of his community, but there is no easy explanation or excuse that will dissolve the ugliness of his association with the Indiana Klan. Everyone was doing it. There's a rationalization meant to put the dissonance with everything else we know to sleep. Now, my point here is not so much about my granddad, but the importance of listening to dissonance, of allowing ourselves to feel the rub and the agitation between what we think and what we've been taught, between what we experience and what we practice. Let me repeat that because it's counterintuitive. It's good. It's very good. When we allow ourselves to feel dissonance between what we've been taught and our actual experience, or between what we believe and espouse and what we actually practice. When there is a crinkle or a rub that makes us uncomfortable, it's better to pick at it than to leave it alone. So again, my granddad may have been a peach of a guy to his family and some in his community, but his participation in the Ku Klux Klan tells us something else as well. Allowing myself to be uncomfortable about my own father's rationalization about his father, because it didn't really jive with my knowledge and experience of people, caused me to acknowledge my granddad's participation in evil. We all have filters, right? I mean, we all have lenses that we've crafted or have been given that explain the world and people around us. There are macro filters that explain the world around us, like science and religion and politics and economics. And there are micro filters like family culture or neighborhood consensus or professional culture or personal prejudices and superstitions. When we feel a dissonance or agitation about something we can't quite put our finger on, it's probably because we're calling into question the trustworthiness of a lens or a filter we've been seeing the world through. In such moments, our instinct is to turn away from the dissonance. Our knee-jerk reaction is to deny or rationalize the discomfort and to move on without, thinking too much about it. But having courage and curiosity to wonder what that dissonance is about and to explore the agitation is the gem that this story about Jesus holds for us. But we have to pay the price of entry in order to see that gem up close. In order to even see the gem that is embedded in this story of Matthew, we may have to question one or more of our filters about Jesus. Now, there is an Orthodox Christian lens, and by Orthodox, I mean small o, not capital O. There's an Orthodox Christian lens that looks at Jesus only through a God and perfection colored glasses. Anytime there's a story in which Jesus says or does what seems distinctly ungodlike and far less than perfect, a corrective lens is asserted that finds an explanation or a rationalization that likely strains credulity but leaves the Orthodox lens intact. If we get curious and muster some courage, the insight in this story is actually low-hanging fruit. This story of Jesus gives us a glimpse of a human being struggling with his own bigotry, along with the lens of his cultural and theological assumptions. If Jesus is perfect, we do not get to see this moment of enlightenment brought on by Jesus listening to the dissonance within himself. The dissonance is between what he says he believes about the universality of God's love held within and the bigotry that is held within the spiritual practice of his own religion. I'd go so far as to say this moment of dissonance and Jesus' willingness to listen to it may be the turning point in the life and ministry of the Messiah. So here's the story behind the story that tells the story. It begins with Jesus ignoring this woman. But that's not all. His bigotry toward her is pretty obvious. He as much as calls her a dog. In fact, he does call her a dog. A mother, desperate to save her child, accosts Jesus. Now consider what we know about the plight of peasants in those days. There is no social safety net, no medicine, and with no money of any kind, there was not even access to spiritual healers. It was a very, very rigid caste system that left poor women utterly powerless and in a society that placed children at the absolute bottom rung of the ladder, where their value was measured in their potential labor. And if you were a female child, your value was measured in your eventual marriageability. As a matter of fact, a poor child possessed by a demon or with mental illness issues was truly a life without value or worth in that society. She would have been completely vulnerable to all forms of human cruelty. The mother, as most mothers do, loved her child beyond value. She would have been beside herself, woeful in her fear about what would happen to her daughter that she loved so much. I'm guessing that most mothers, and fathers too, would chase down any and all options. So, despite the social and ethnic wedge that stood between this woman and Jesus, the mother goes after Jesus. She is poor, and so she's already learned not to be too polite. That would get her nowhere in the first century. Instead, she charges into the crowd of men and she shouts. And that's important. She shouts. She yells at Jesus to stop. Have mercy. Have mercy. Now, my image of this moment is that of Jesus as a deer in the headlights. We should also remember that mercy was a special feature of Jesus' basic stump speech. So just fix the scene in our imagination of this aggressive, outcast woman publicly begging Jesus for mercy. The first thing Jesus does is ignore her. How human. Ignore it and hope it goes away. I'm good at that. I imagine you might be too. But his disciples did not allow an avoidance strategy. They begged Jesus instead, and I quote, "Get rid of her." That's harsh, Jesus might have said to himself, but still he concurred. "Look, lady, I'm not here for the Canaanites." He probably sort of motioned her to leave like shoo. "If you want to know the truth, lady, I was sent to help the lost sheep of among my fellow Galileans and Judeans. I got nothing for you." Now, to put a really, really fine point on this moment, we need to recall what Jesus said just prior to this experience. Seriously, this is unbelievable. In Matthew's version of the story, here's what Jesus said just before. What comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intentions. He said that just before this encounter with the poor woman. Granddad, is that you? Something dark slipped out from the heart of Jesus. In fact, Jesus' treatment of this woman contradicts everything he's just preached. Remember what I said about dissonance? One source of it is the rub between what we say we believe and value and how we actually behave. When there is that dissonance, pick at it. Hypocrisy is pretty human. I hope I'm not speaking out of school when I suggest that you may have had some experience with hypocrisy yourself. I know I have. All of us violate our own values and veer off the walk of our talk. But the question for Jesus and for us is, what do we do about it? Go away, lady. You're not my concern. Sounds so awful to us, but we can rationalize it like my dad did for my granddad. Jesus feels completely justified in ignoring this woman and for asserting any immediate distance between them. As you see, Judeans and Galileans saw Canaanites as morally unclean and socially despicable and ritually filthy. Keeping a social distance from such low life was integral to the practice of good faith. In fact, think about this. For Jesus, social distance from a Canaanite was practicing good hygiene and good faith. Plus, she's unattended, and so Jesus has plenty of reasons not to get close. Social and religious policy dictated that men not enter into conversation or deal with in any way with an unrelated woman, especially one that was not with a man. Again, that was a matter of good hygiene and good faith too. And the reason for that, I hesitate to say, was because a woman might be on her menstrual cycle. If a man touched a woman when she was menstruating, he would make himself unclean. Making himself unclean would separate him from the company of other men and from any religious activity. So you could not associate with a woman you did not know. And on top of all that, there was a reputational issue of her being unaccompanied by a man. Jesus just wanted her to go away. Clearly, Jesus does not want to help her. He may even be disgusted by her. His compassion was not aroused, nor was his mercy. He was likely repulsed or closed off by the cultural and religious lenses that he wore. On top of all that, everything in the culture justified and reinforced his rejection of her. Everyone does it. But, and here's the gem, Jesus seems to have listened to the dissonance and recognized what we so clearly see in the story from our safe historical distance. That his first response, while very much part of the normalcy of his moment in time, is the wrong response when seen through the lens of God's love. Friends, we need to pick at the dissonance when it arises within us amidst this current political moment. And in the rising up of people of color insisting that the impact of 400 years of slavery now be addressed and now be reconciled and now start to be healed. We need to pick at the dissonance within us. Whenever we feel defensive about our own privilege or victimized in our whiteness, hostile or afraid or mistrustful of any class or category of human being, as if Canaanites are somehow different than Galileans. We need to listen to the dissonance between the universal love of God and the normal and routine prejudices, bigotries, and fears held within the lenses we've been given or we've crafted for ourselves. So if any of what I'm saying is disconcerting or agitating in any way, good. Pick at it. Explore it. Follow what you know about the universal love of God. Discover what is in the dissonance when you follow the universal love of God and our call to be agents of that love. Thank you. Thanks for listening. And peace be with you.